problem that I call Strawson's problem. I think other people call it something similar as well. And most people in the room are probably already vaguely familiar with the idea behind it. The problem, I'm going to treat it as kind of a generalization of an objection that Strawson originally pressed against Carnap, and specifically against Carnap's views on explication. So this is on here a quote that I've used probably about like 10 times at this point in my work, but you know, bear with me. So this is Strawson, and he says, to offer formal explanations of key terms of scientific theories to one who seeks philosophical illumination of concepts of non-scientific discourse is to do something utterly irrelevant. It's a sheer misunderstanding, like offering a textbook on physiology to someone who says, with a sigh, that he wished he understood the workings of the human heart. Now, maybe a little more direct expression of the problem. The claim is that to explicate a philosophical concept is not to solve philosophical problems, but to change the subject. So that's a worry that was pressed against explication in Carnap's sense, but it generalizes to conceptual engineering as a whole. And you might think of it sort of this way. Conceptual engineering, the goal is to revise or replace concepts, or if you don't like concepts, maybe to revise or replace linguistic expressions. But if we are not careful, those revisions run at the risk of altering the concept so much that we are changing the subject. So just as a basic example, suppose that you're an epistemologist and you want to know the nature of knowledge. Well, it doesn't seem legitimate to sort of try to meet that goal by stipulating a definition for knowledge, right? To just say, well, look, I'm just going to say knowledge is henceforth defined as justified true belief. That seems illegitimate. If you did that, well, the revised concept wouldn't be the concept knowledge. It would be something like knowledge star. And it seems intuitive that you can't answer our original philosophical questions about knowledge by talking about knowledge star. Okay, my keys are, here we go. And so Herman Kaplan in his recent book talks about this problem in a couple of chapters, and I like his take on it because it gives a good sense of why this is an important problem. So why is changing the subject so much of a problem? Well, here's how Herman puts it. He says, answers to philosophical questions that employ terms with new extensions fail to answer the original questions. The answers to those questions concern something new. We have the illusion of an answer, but it's a purely verbal illusion. There's a lack of continuity of inquiry. The old questions are not being answered. So there's a sort of problem that's prompted by Strawson's worry here, which is that if you are not careful, there's going to be a lack of continuity of inquiry. I think there's a similar sort of problem that arises in this context, and it's that if we're not careful, conceptual engineering may just trivialize philosophical problem solving. And the take on this I like is from Frank Jackson, and it's not originally pressed against conceptual engineering. This is sort of before conceptual engineering's rise in popularity, but it's relevant. So here's Frank Jackson. If I say what I mean, never mind what others mean, by belief, is any information carrying state that, I can't even see the right side of my slide, but causes to utter sentences like, I believe that snow is white, the existence of beliefs so conceived will be safe from the limitativist arguments. But I will not have much of an audience. I've turned interesting philosophical debates into easy exercises in deduction from stipulative definitions together with accepted facts, right? So it becomes trivial to solve philosophical problems. Okay, so here's why I think Strawson's problem deserves an answer, even if that answer is, this is a silly problem. The question is this: how does a conceptual engineer avoid these two worries, right? Disrupting the continuity of inquiry and trivializing philosophical problem solving. So I think if we're offering a complete account of conceptual engineering, there needs to be an answer to this, and it needs to involve specifying the boundaries of permissible revision, even if it's to say there are no boundaries, right? But there needs to be some answer to the question, how much revision is too much, and some answer to the question, why? Why is that too much? Okay, now that's the basic problem. What I want to talk about today is potential strategies for solving that problem. and how they could possibly deal with a certain set of cases that I take to be actually a little bit difficult to deal with. So it's a group of cases that I'm going to propose challenge certain approaches to solving Strawson's problem. And the type of cases that I'm going to talk about today are multiple successor engineering proposals. Okay, so what's that? For some reason, come on, slide. Go to the next slide. Here we go. Okay. So when you read the conceptual engineering literature, the standard sort of examples that people put out tend to be one-to-one, right? They tend to be cases where you have this pre-engineering concept, let's call it A, and then you revise that pre-engineering concept into B, right? So it's either revised into B or replaced by B, or maybe on some views, it just turns out that it was B all along and we discover that A was actually B, okay? Standard examples that fall into that one-to-one type category. You have, for instance, Sally Haslinger's revisionary definition of woman, right? You've got this pre-theoretic idea of what a woman is, and then you revise it to this more socially acceptable idea of what a woman is. You've got the attempt to recognize same-sex partnerships as falling under the extension of marriage, right? That's one-to-one. You've got these, the example of Clark and Chalmers pushing for cases of the extended mind falling under the category of belief, right? All of these are sort of one-to-one cases where the revision involves taking A and getting B. Okay, but that's only one possible type of conceptual engineering, and there's plenty of versions of conceptual engineering that are instead one-to-many. So an example that I'm going to use as an example here, and Professor Sharp's in the room, so hopefully I don't get him too wrong. So Kevin Sharp's proposed revision of the concept of truth, right? And the idea here is that, well, the concept of truth is inconsistent, and we would improve it by replacing it in some context with two engineered successors, right? And the two engineered successors obey different principles. One of these engineered successors is called ascending truth, and the other is called descending truth. And the basic principles that govern them are on the slide here. So if snow is white, then, quote, snow is white is ascending true. And if, quote, snow is white is descending true, then snow is white. Okay. All right, so that's a case of one-to-many conceptual engineering where you start with truth, right? Just this one concept, and you end up with multiple concepts at the end of the revision. That's not an outlier case. Conceptual division of that sort, I think, is fairly common. You could do it to avoid inconsistency or paradoxes like Professor Sharp does, but you can also do this sort of conceptual division when you simply realize that you've got a concept that is too broad or that neglects a certain important distinction that we think is worth making. So there's plenty of examples that we could throw out here. I'll just pick a few from science and social science. The first one is actually borrowed from Sharp, and that is the revision of this sort of early theoretic notion of mass into a more sophisticated concept or pair of concepts that works with special relativity, right? There are other examples sort of like this. Within psychology, we don't tend to just use this notion of memory simpliciter. We have several different varieties of memory, working memory, long-term memory, and so forth. And then within the social sciences, you've got this distinction between sex and gender, where these are sort of carved off from this initial sort of more vague concepts that seem to cover both notions. Now, I think this is extremely common within philosophy. So within philosophy, you've got people constantly introducing distinctions to clarify concepts that were previously overbroad or just covered things that were distinct, right? So we've got the notion of consciousness being sort of subdivided or clarified into the notions of phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. We've got reference being broken down into semantic reference and speaker's reference. Analyticity, this is from a work by Boghossian, subdividing this kind of vague notion of analyticity into two notions of metaphysical analyticity and epistemic analyticity. Necessity has been subdivided in all kinds of fun ways: logical necessity, metaphysical necessity, nomological necessity, epistemic necessity, and so forth, right? So we could keep this list going for a really long time, but this type of move is very common in philosophy. And I do view it as a case of conceptual engineering. We're introducing more specific concepts to either replace or supplement previous broad concepts. Okay, so probably initial thought when thinking of this cases is, well, we don't necessarily get rid of the original concepts in these cases. In a lot of these cases, the original persists as what you might call like sort of an umbrella type. So we still do use the term memory, even though we've got these more specific subcategories of working memory. But you've still got certain contexts in which these more specific successors replace the original, right? So in a technical context where I previously might have just used the term memory, I might now use the term working memory. Or in a previous context where I might have just said analyticity, I might now be more specific and say, oh, what I mean is epistemic analyticity. So you are having what I would call a partial replacement. And a partial replacement is still one-to-many, it's not one-to-one. And it's got a structure like the following on the slide. You start with this initial concept A, and then post-revision, you have a set of concepts, which includes A, but also includes these successor concepts B1 through Bn. Okay, now of course you can also have a sort of simpler partial replacements. Simpler partial replacements would just have a form like A being replaced or revised into this set A and B, right? So an example of this might be, for instance, credence in philosophy. We've just got this one sort of technical version of this kind of standard English language term credence. So the original persists, people still use credence outside of the philosophy classroom, but in certain philosophical contexts, we use this much more specific technical notion of credence. So you can have that form of case too. You can also have a case where the original term is simply abandoned, right? So A is fully replaced by the set of successors B1 through Bn. I don't think this actually is too terribly common, but it might happen when the original is seriously defective, right? If it's inconsistent, for instance. So it is certainly a possibility. Okay, and now, of course, there's other cases that aren't going to be as central for us, but I just want to mention them as non-one-to-one forms of conceptual engineering. If you invent a new concept from scratch, then you are making what's essentially a 0-to-1 case of conceptual engineering. There was no concept there, and now there is a concept. So it is not 1-to-1, it is 0-to-1. And then finally, you can have cases of what I'd call many-to-many replacement, right? Which would be, for instance, when you move from one type of classificatory system to a different sort of classificatory system. And the case I like to use here is biological taxonomy, right? So earlier taxonomical systems were, you know, in the manner of Linnaeus, they were sort of, I guess, by phenotype roughly, maybe. And more modern systems classify species by clades, okay? So a move in taxonomical system would be an instance of a many-to-many replacement, and it would have a form something like on the slide here, where you've got one set, A1 through AN, say, and you replace it with another set of concepts, B1 through BN. Oh, yeah, two more types of case actually to mention as sort of, you know, just stretching our boundaries of conceptual engineering beyond just one-to-one cases. You can have cases of many-to-one conceptual engineering, maybe not as common, but they may exist. And that type of case would occur if we find that a distinction is illusory or otherwise just undesirable. So one instance here that might count is sort of abandonment of really fine-grained racial classifications, right? So it used to be quite common to use terms like mulatto or quadroon, which, you know, if you are not familiar with those terms, mulatto is half black and quadroon is a quarter black. People think those terms are quite racist now and would not use them. And it's much more common to just use a sort of broad category, multiracial. Okay, we don't think it's worth figuring out whether you're a quadroon or an octoroon or whatever. So this would be a case where you had a set of concepts and you sort of squashed them together because you thought that having that multitude was actually undesirable. So it would be a case where you go from a set A1 through AN to just B. And then finally, of course, there's elimination of concepts. And I would view this as a case of conceptual engineering if you argue for abandoning a concept, right? So eliminativism in the philosophy of mind is a classic case here. And cases like that would be cases of 1 to 0 conceptual engineering. Okay, so we've got a whole set of different possible types of conceptual engineering that are not just 1 to 1. For some of those, I think you could probably argue that Strawson's problem doesn't apply, right? Particularly 0 to 1 cases. There's no real issue of changing the subject if there's no subject to change in the first place. But for a lot of the cases, 1 to many being a particular case that I think this applies to, Strawson's problem still seems to be a worry. And if that's right, then a satisfactory sort of response to this Strawson worry is going to need to be applicable beyond the basic 1 to 1 case. Okay, now here's where we get into the worry. And the worry is that at least some immediate sort of ideas that you might have for solutions to Strawson's problem, for sort of ways of specifying the boundaries of permissible revision, they don't work very well with multiple successor cases. Multiple successor cases turn out to be very tricky to handle. So I'm not going to use a particular view in the literature as my initial example here. I'm going to use kind of a stripped down potential view. I'm going to call it the simple identity view. But I think it's maybe the first thing people think of in response to Strawson's problem. So here's a hypothetical view, simple identity. Simple identity says that an engineered revision of concept A is beyond the bounds of permissible revision if the resulting concept, call it B, is no longer the same concept as A. Okay. Quite simple sort of view. And the idea here intuitively would be that what this view says is that changing the subject amounts to a break in conceptual identity. Okay, so why doesn't this work too well with multiple successor cases? Well, I'm going to use Professor Sharp's truth view as an example here, and I'm going to use it a little bit contrary to his intention because he doesn't want to fully replace the notion of truth. But let's suppose that he did. Suppose that he was proposing that we fully replace truth with these two successor concepts, ascending truth and descending truth. Now, you immediately, the simple identity view runs into a difficulty here because it's not clear which of those two concepts is the same concept as truth. They both seem to have a fairly equal claim to being the same concept as truth, if either of them has a claim to it at all. One doesn't seem to have an advantage over the other. Now, I think it's pretty intuitively the case that ascending truth and descending truth are not the same concept. So if we say that truth is identical to one of these concepts, well, since the two resulting concepts are not identical, we would have to conclude that truth is not identical to the second of them, right? So if truth is the same concept as ascending truth, well, truth is not the same concept as descending truth. Okay. If that's right, then this sort of simple identity view, which is a bit of a straw man and doesn't belong to anyone, but use it as a toy example here, the simple identity view has to conclude that if one successor is a permissible revision, the other isn't, right? Because what the simple identity view says is it's a permissible revision if we've still got the same concept. Okay, so if truth equals ascending truth, then ascending truth is a permissible sort of successor, but descending truth is not. Now, of course, the other alternative is to say that neither of these two is the same concept as truth, but then the result would be that on this view, neither is a legitimate successor. Okay, so I've used Sharp's proposal as an example here, but you can run this same problem for the other sorts of cases of conceptual division that I listed. So I'll use metaphysical and epistemic analyticity as an example here. I don't know how familiar people are with this distinction, but it's basically what it says on the tin. One is a reading of analyticity that takes it to be a metaphysical notion, and the other takes it to be an epistemic notion. And the idea is that the original notion of analyticity kind of ran those two together. Well, metaphysical analyticity and epistemic analyticity are not the same concept on any notion. And since that's correct, then at most one of those two can be considered the same concept as our original pre-theoretic concept of analyticity. And you can run that same line for all sorts of conceptual divisions that we've already looked at. Okay, now the sort of basic case that I'm starting with here is one in which both successors, in which you've got sort of two successors and both have sort of an equal claim to being the same concept, right? I think, you know, Sharp's case is a nice clear sort of, you know, neither has a better claim sort of case. But that's not the only case you can run this with, right? I mean, this starts out looking sort of like a personal identity fission problem, but it's not quite the same problem. And to see why, consider a case of partial replacement, which we've discussed a little bit earlier. So in a case of partial replacement, you start with A is your initial concept, and at the end of the revision process, you have a set of concepts. A persists, and then you've also got B1 through Bn, which are sort of more technical, perhaps, concepts. So a case like this might be memory. We start with memory, and then we've also got these sort of technical notions of working memory and long-term memory and such that replace, you know, memory simpliciter in certain contexts. Now, if you've got a case like that of partial replacement, well, then it's not too tricky to figure out what is the same concept as the original A. It's A is still there. But if that's right, then the other concepts, which are different concepts, are going to be illegitimate on this sort of simple identity view where changing the concept is impermissible, right? B1 through Bn in this case are not the same concept as A, and that would imply that they are impermissible revisions and cannot legitimately replace uses of A. Okay, so just to run through a standard sort of example here, if you think that the concept of analyticity has not been replaced fully by successor notions of epistemic analyticity and metaphysical analyticity, if you think it persists, well, the simple identity view would claim that, well, it's still there, so analyticity is obviously the same concept as analyticity, which would imply that epistemic analyticity and metaphysical analyticity are not the same concept. And since they are not the same concept, it is not permissible to use them as successors. And so the implication would be, for instance, that it's impermissible to use epistemic analyticity in place of analyticity simpliciter in discussions of a priori knowledge. Same thing could be run with Sharp's proposal as he intends it, which is to only have the successor concepts replace truth in certain contexts. Well, on the simple identity view, these successor concepts are still going to be illegitimate when used in the philosophy classroom, for instance. Okay. Okay, so that was a puzzle that I proposed for a view that I'm not sure actually exists in the literature, right? The view being that the boundaries of revision are essentially set by conceptual identity, and that changing the identity of a concept changes the subject, right? That view, I think, is going to have at least some prima facie difficulties with dealing with these sort of multiple successor cases. The problem is that I think this same sort of puzzle is going to generalize to views that do exist, okay? The simple identity view is a little bit pared down and simple, but there are accounts that come kind of close to it. One is from a paper that I quite like from Michael Prinzing, who gives a sort of functional view of conceptual engineering, but says that the way to prevent the sort of discontinuity in inquiry is by retaining the concept's function, and retaining the concept's function for Prinzing preserves the identity of the concept. So what he claims is preserve a concept's function and you preserve the concept itself, preserve the concept and you preserve the subject. So that's close to a simple identity view, and it's not immediately apparent how to deal with multiple successors in such a case. Okay, now that's the closest view to simple identity. There is another sort of set of views which don't always talk about conceptual identity or sameness of concept, but instead talk about sameness of topic. So discussions of Strawson's problem often sort of say, well, okay, how do we make sure that our revisions maintain sameness of topic? And sameness of topic is going to fix the boundaries of permissible revisions in conceptual engineering. So Herman Kaplan stands as an example of this sort of idea. He's got a part of his manuscript that is titled Topic Continuity as the Limits of Revision. And topic continuity itself is picked out by the phenomenon of same-saying, or sort of in more general terms, saying the same thing as. So as long as I'm saying the same thing as a person who speaks the post-revision talk, well, then the revision has been permissible. Okay, now Sarah Sawyer has a view as well that talks about topic as sort of delineating what's permissible. What she says is that conceptual engineering narrowly construed, where I understand what she means here is that conceptual engineering narrowly construed excludes elimination and de novo introductions. So conceptual engineering narrowly construed essentially involves topic preservation through semantic change. And in that same paper, she actually appeals to the notion of the same concept to secure preservation of topic. So again, this is actually a case that comes somewhat close to this simple identity view. And then finally, you've got Amy Thomason also mentions the notion of sameness of topic, although this oversimplifies her account quite a bit. But here's a quote from her. She says, "The challenge is to find a way to understand sameness of topic in such a way that I can't actually read what's on my slide. Conceptual engineering enables us to improve our concepts without changing the subject." Okay, now the same problem that we just looked at for identity of concept can be at least roughly run for identity of topic, right? So let's go back to Sharp's example. If I'm talking about descending truth and somebody in the next room is talking about ascending truth, we're not talking about the same thing. We don't intuitively share a topic. And the same goes for instance, the categories of epistemic analyticity and metaphysical analyticity. If I talk about one of these and somebody in the other room talks about the other, we're not talking about the same thing. Somebody talking about speaker's meaning is not talking about the same thing as semantic meaning, right? They don't share a topic. Okay, so if the boundaries of permissible revision in conceptual engineering are set by this sort of same topic criterion, if the successor B has to share the same topic as A, well, you're going to run into the same sort of problem, right, with cases of multiple successors, because there will be at least one impermissible revision in any case where you've got a pair of successors that concern different topics, right? As in, for example, ascending and descending truth. Okay, now this isn't quite as bad a problem for the same topic type view as it is for the simple identity view. And the reason why is, well, it's at least plausible that different concepts might be able to share a topic. Okay, so there can be permissible cases of multiple successor engineering if you manage to get those successors to share a topic. And I think you can run into cases like this. So for instance, a case of partial replacement. We've got a sort of everyday notion of depression, and then there's a more technical, narrower concept of clinical depression that is defined in the DSM. Well, it seems reasonable at least to say that even though those might be different concepts, they share a topic. Okay. One is maybe a more precise take on that topic. And so a lot of this is going to depend on how we cash out the notion of topic, how narrow topics turn out to be. That will determine how plausible it is that you're going to have multiple successor cases to sort of get around this problem. But if topics are fairly narrow, then you're going to have a fairly large number of multiple successor cases that end up being impermissible, because at least some of these successors will change topic from the original, the other successors. Okay, so I think I can pick on Capellan a little bit with this, because I think that his particular account, at least as stated, sort of falls prey to this. So he has got this claim in his book that we can sort of pick out topic continuity by appeal to same-saying. Same-saying is kind of a notion that appears in philosophy of language literature, and I'm not by any means an expert on it, but we can get sort of a sense of what's the intended idea by thinking of this sort of general notion of saying the same thing as. And one test that we can have of that comes up in this literature is the test of indirect quotation. So if you've got a subject that makes an utterance that involves the concept A, would it be possible to accurately report her with an utterance using B instead? So an example that shows up in this literature, if I say, Galileo said that the earth moves, that seems fine. That seems like I'm accurately reporting what Galileo said. But of course, I'm not directly quoting Galileo because Galileo spoke Italian, so he absolutely did not say the earth moves. But I have same said him. I have said the same thing that he said, even though I didn't use the exact same words. So Capellan's claim is that topic continuity can be sort of tracked by same-saying. But here's the thing, that's going to result in a fairly narrow notion of topics. I can't, for instance, indirectly quote somebody who's talking about epistemical analyticity by saying, oh, so-and-so said thus and so about metaphysical analyticity. There's no way for me to same-say in that way. Since that is sort of not possible, then the suggestion here would be that epistemic analyticity and metaphysical analyticity don't share a topic on Capellan's notion of what a topic is. And as we've seen, it seems like at best, one of them is going to be able to be on the same topic as the original notion of analyticity. And if that's right, then at least one of those two successor concepts changes the subject, essentially. Okay, so I actually want to make a side note here, just expressing my own ignorance, because people use this notion of topic, and I'm actually not certain whether they just really mean this to be the same as what Strawson means when he says subject, right? So Strawson complains about changing the subject. These philosophers that I've just mentioned worry about changing the topic. So I'm not clear whether preserving sameness of topic just is another way of saying not changing the subject. If that's right, then this isn't really, so much a solution to Strawson's problem, but just sort of a restatement of what the problem is, right? And if that's what people have in mind, that topics and subjects are roughly the same, then the fact that we can run this sort of puzzle for topics suggests that this is actually kind of inherent to Strawson's problem, right? The need to maintain sameness of subject is going to immediately run into these sorts of problems with multiple successors, because at best, some subset of them is going to be on the same subject. Insofar as you can have a pair of the successors that are not on the same subject, at least one of them is going to be impermissible. Okay. All right, so that's the general idea of the problem, and I think it hits this sameness of topic view fairly strongly. I want to talk about some possible sort of fixes that can kind of correct these views to deal with this multiple successor problem. But before I do that, I want to look at one more possible option for dealing with Strawson's problem that's come up a couple times in the literature. And it's one that actually I've argued for a little myself. And it's an appeal to preservation of function as a means of not changing the subject or otherwise performing a permissible revision. Okay, so I've already noted Amy Thomason's view. She argues for topic preservation, as I've already mentioned, but she makes the suggestion that we can cash out topic preservation via preservation of function. I'm doing her a bit of a disservice by giving you this brief summary of her view, because she is quite flexible with this. She thinks that you can kind of tinker around with the notion of topic, but she does put this forth, that topic preservation can occur via preservation of function. I've also noted a paper from Michael Prinzing who argues for conceptual identity via preservation of function. So this ends up being a type of view where keeping the same function is the way to avoid changing the subject. And then there's also a paper by Mona Simeon, which similarly appeals to the need to preserve functions within a permissible revision. She actually targets Sally Haslinger's revisionary definition of the term woman. And what she claims about it is that it fails as a revision because it fails to serve the main function of woman, where the main function is something like the representational function of picking out women. So again, the suggestion, although it's not quite as explicit in that paper, is that the boundaries of permissible revision are set by something functional, by roughly the successor having the same function as the predecessor. Okay, now this is actually, I think, a type of view that's going to deal with the multiple successor problem a little more successfully than, say, something like Capellan's account, and certainly more successfully than the initial kind of pretend hypothetical account that I gave you, the simple identity view. I think you can have a view of what it is to have the same function that will allow in cases of multiple successors. But a lot's going to hang on the details here, right? It's going to hang on, for instance, the particular account's notion of what it is to have the same function. And I've put in here in parentheses, you know, the same main or primary function. There's a lot of flexibility with this type of account in what exactly you say about whether concepts have multiple functions, and if they do, whether one in particular is the sort of, you know, maybe proper function of the concept that needs to be preserved. But if you have a fairly kind of strict sense of this sort of preservation of function, then again, you might run into certain difficulties with these types of engineering proposals that subdivide concepts. So for instance, think about the various subdivisions of the concept of necessity. Do nomological necessity and epistemic necessity, do those two concepts serve the same function? No, I mean, I don't have a particular account of function to offer, but my initial response would be to say, no, I don't think they do. And I'm even more confident on the idea that the concepts of sex and gender serve different functions, right? Okay, so I will I'm not doing the function views justice at the moment, and I will come back to them shortly. But first I want to kind of summarize where we're at and then move on to sort of how to fix this up. Okay, so if you have a response to Strawson's problem that appeals to identity, basically, concept identity, topic identity, function identity, then you are at risk of deeming impermissible lots and lots of cases of conceptual engineering, right? Any, or at least a large subset of cases of one-to-many conceptual revision or replacement, which, as we've seen, are extremely common within philosophy. Concept identity, I think, suffers the biggest problem here. It rules out the largest number of possible revisions. Topic identity, I think, can maybe let in a few. Identity of function is maybe, again, going to possibly let in a few more, depending on how easy it is for two different concepts to have the same function. But again, there's going to be a lot of cases that at least intuitively get deemed impermissible by these sorts of accounts of the boundaries of revision. So I haven't done anything like a thorough sort of survey of all the possible accounts on offer and how they sort of run up against this problem. But I think it'd probably be better at this point to start talking about how to fix the problem, how to sort of amend these types of accounts to get around this sort of worry that multiple successor cases are going to be deemed impermissible. Okay. So obviously the first thing that one could do would be to bite the bullet, right? And this would involve claiming that the limits on revision are very tight. Okay. That might be okay if you just ended up ruling out, you know, poor Professor Sharp's view, right? If we just had a few proposals that fell to that, that might be okay. But I think this type of case where you've got multiple successors to an initial concept, that type of case is extremely common. Not just cases of full replacement, but cases of partial replacement where you keep the original concept and have one or more other more technical concepts that supplement it, right? On certain views, those are going to be ruled out, and I think that's quite the bullet to bite. I don't think that's very appealing. So I don't like that response. More plausible is to say, well, look, this is not the type of case that the sort of accounts are designed to deal with, right? So you might say multiple successor cases are outside the scope of these proposed accounts on the limits of revision. And I think that might be what some people already have in mind. So for instance, Michael Prinzing in this paper that I've mentioned actually talks about Kevin Sharp's proposal. And so he's aware of these sorts of subdivision type cases. And what he says about them is, well, look, there are some cases where Strawson's problem just isn't a problem. It's not an objection. Sometimes changing the subject is a good thing. And I think a lot of people actually have this idea that, well, changing the subject is a problem sometimes, but it's not always a problem. And if you could run that, then you might have a way of dealing with these multiple successor cases. So the idea would be the criterion of permissible revision, whether that's sameness of topic or whatever you've decided. You could say, well, that only applies to some forms of revision. Let's say it just doesn't apply to the non-identical successors in partial replacement cases, right? So where working memory as a partial successor to memory. Right, it just doesn't apply there. That's not, we don't have to worry about changing the subject in that case. In cases like those, it's okay to change the subject, to change the topic, to change the function. Okay, I don't like that route either. And the reason why is because I think it just kind of avoids or ignores the problem, because the worries that we've mentioned that make Strawson's problem a problem, those worries arise for the multiple successor cases too, and they arise for the non-identical successors in partial replacements. So yeah, it's okay to say that sometimes you're allowed to change the subject, but if you do that, you're still left with a need to account for the limits of revision in those cases, in the cases where you're permitting a change of subject. So if you allow certain subject changing proposals, what you're really doing is denying that subject change is that which places the limits on permissible revision, right? So what you've done is just say, well, I'm just disagreeing with Strawson on what sets the boundaries here. But that doesn't remove the problem. You still need to tell us what the limits of revision are, right? So let me just use poor Professor Sharp as an example again, to sort of see why I think this is still, you can't just, kind of push this to the side in this way. So suppose that we take Sharp's account, but instead of replacing truth with these nicely engineered ascending and descending truths, we replace truth with two successors, ham sandwich, left shoe. Okay. This is not a very promising way of, I mean, you'd probably get out of the paradoxes this way, I assume, but still not a particularly promising proposal for a way to avoid the inconsistency of the truth concept. Why? Because it would run into the exact problems that we started out with. There would be a serious disruption of continuity of inquiry, right? We'd no longer be talking about the same thing. And the sorts of questions that initially prompted us to think about truth would be just utterly on the wayside, right? For that reason, this, ham sandwich revision idea is impermissible, right? That seems to be beyond the boundaries of permissible revision. So we've still got Strawson's problem here, right? We've still got Strawson's problem in cases of multiple succession. They're not immune to this problem. They're not outside of the scope of this problem in the way that something like inventing a concept from scratch would be. if you really want a successful account of conceptual engineering and of what constitutes a reasonable revision, well, that an account of that nature is going to need to explain the wrongness of hand-sandwich revisions, right? Why do these disrupt the continuity of inquiry? What is the problem with these? Why are they beyond the bounds of permissible revision? Okay, same thing goes for partial replacements, right? So you might say, well, look, in cases of partial replacement, we're not fully changing the subject because the original subject is still there. We're not abandoning the initial philosophical questions that, for instance, prompted us to think about truth or knowledge or whatever, because we still retain the original concept. We've just got these other concepts too. So you might have this notion that, oh, okay, well, we don't have the same worry there. We're not abandoning the subject. But the thing is, the fact that the subject hasn't been abandoned doesn't mean that anything goes for these other successors, because these other successors, in cases of partial replacement, are replacing A within some context. And if they amount to changing the subject, then there is still the risk that those replacements will disrupt inquiry in those contexts. Okay. So if you sort of try to deem cases like that out of the scope of Strawson's problem, it seems to me you're just pushing Strawson's problem under the rug. Okay, so let me use an example to to clarify what I mean there. So go back to the case of epistemic analyticity and metaphysical analyticity. So in the paper where Boghossian first introduces this distinction, one of his claims is that there are no metaphysically analytic sentences. So here we've got a case of, I don't know if we want to call it partial revision, but we might. I mean, we still do use the notion analyticity simpliciter. So let's call it a case of partial revision. We've got these two successor concepts that in some contexts take the place of analyticity simpliciter. For instance, in Boghossian's claim, there are no metaphysically analytic sentences. Now the thing is, part of the sort of value of Boghossian's claim here is that it is connected in some way to Quine's original arguments against analyticity, that it is continuing the sort of inquiry that you get in Quine's original paper. If Boghossian had defined metaphysical analyticity in some way that was too disconnected from the way that Quine used analyticity, then you would have had a, well, much less interesting sort of proposal, right? So suppose Boghossian had defined metaphysical analyticity as truth in virtue of community consensus. That would not have necessarily been false to say that there are no metaphysically analytic sentences on that notion, the sort of community consensus notion. And it wouldn't have necessarily been a trivial claim either, but it would have been problematic for another reason. It would have been problematic because it was disconnected from the initial inquiries into analyticity. Right? There would have been a disconnect, a disruption of the continuity of inquiry. So even for cases like this that involve making these conceptual distinctions and subdivisions, there needs to be continuity of some sort. Right? These are still subject to Strawson's worry. Okay, so here's the moral. An account of the boundaries of permissible revision and replacement is still needed for multiple successor cases. And it's needed for the same reasons as it's needed in one-to-one cases. So it doesn't, I don't think it works to simply deem such cases sort of out of bounds of one's particular account of the boundaries of revision. It doesn't remove the problem to do that. It just makes your account incomplete. Now that may not mean that your account is false, but you could have, two different accounts, one for how to have permissible revision in one-to-one cases and one for how to do permissible revision in one-to-many cases. But certainly that seems at least a little bit undesirable, right? And all things being equal, it seems like it would be better to have a unified solution to Strawson's problem. Okay, so here's another possible way you could go. We've talked about potential accounts that mark the boundaries of permissible revision in terms of identity, right? Of subject, of topic, or of function. And you might think, okay, well, why not just move to similarity? right? Similarity doesn't run into the same sort of transitivity issues as identity does, so it could avoid some of these worries with the multiple successors. That might work. I haven't thought this all the way through, but I think that in order to run something like that, you're at least going to need a lot of substantial additions to your account. It's not going to work out of the box, as it were. And the reason why is that mere similarity isn't enough to avoid disruption of inquiry, right? So let's take the example of the various sort of fine-grained notions of necessity. Take in particular nomological necessity. Now, if seems fairly intuitive to me, I mean, more or less, that nomological necessity is, let's say, similar in topic to necessity, simpliciter. But you can't just substitute nomological necessity for necessity just because it's similar. It would disrupt inquiry if you did that, if it was the only replacement for necessity. If you just said, throw out necessity, we're going to replace it with nomological necessity. That would not work, right? The reason why nomological necessity is a good successor is because it comes along with a bunch of other successors, right? In order for this to be a good case of conceptual engineering, it needs to be supplemented with additional specialized concepts. And what that suggests is you can't just have a criterion like this. B may replace B, or sorry, B may replace A if B is similar in topic to A. That alone isn't enough. You're going to need some more work to run a sort of similarity of topic line. Maybe it's possible, but it doesn't work out of the box. Okay, my preferred sort of approach. My preferred approach is, instead of moving to similarity, to sort of instead abandon the idea that there's going to be a single subject or a single topic or a single function that constrains permissible revisions of our original concept, right? And now the way that I've initially thought of this, I'm not sure if I'm still believe this, but here's a view that I was initially drawn to, right? You could do a functional account where you simply recognize that most concepts have multiple functions, and then you can say that a case of multiple successor revision is permissible because, for instance, the initial concept A had functions x, y, z, and the set of successor functions takes over those various functions. So successor B1 has function x, B2 has function y, B3 has function z. So all of the functions are preserved in the set of successors. I think that type of move is fairly easy to understand in the case of functions. I don't know if you could run something similar for topics, to say that, for instance, the original concept of analyticity involves multiple topics and the multiple successors each take over one of the topics. It doesn't immediately sound intuitive to me to do it, but maybe you could come up with an account of topic that would make that work. Another possibility would be to say that the original concept changes topic across contexts. I think that's maybe a little more promising here, and I think there's probably moves in that direction you could make. But again, I think it's not gonna work without some tinkering, right? So, for instance, if you're Herman Capellen and you've got this same saying idea for how to mark the boundaries of permissible revision, well, maybe there's some sort of context sensitivity in same saying that could do the work that you need here, but I haven't bothered to think through all of the details of how that sort of account would work, and I don't think it's trivial to do it. I think that it would take quite a lot of extra specification to do a sort of multiple topics or topic change across context kind of line that would deal with the types of cases that I've presented here. Okay, now, like I said, I kind of like the multiple function route, and I think that's pretty close to the right answer, but I want to kind of come close to ending by giving you one last case that I think actually is going to still be problematic, even if we go the sort of multiple function route. We've talked mostly about one-to-many cases, but I think that the final class of cases that I want to talk about, many-to-many cases, is actually going to be the most difficult to sort of fit into Strawson's problem. So just to refresh your memory, these are cases that have the form up on the slides here, where you've got a certain set of concepts that you start with, A1 through AN, and then post-revision, you have another set of concepts, B1 through BN. This kind of case would occur when you are, for instance, moving from one classificatory system to another. So I want to give you a quick example of why I think that these are going to be particularly difficult to deal with, and then I'm going to end with a final sort of suggestion on how you might modify the account in response to this. Okay, so I'm going to stick with the example from biology. So modern biology has sort of moved from a more classic Linnaean style taxonomy to one based on clades. And the sort of traditional taxonomy included a taxon called Pisces, which more or less corresponds to what we lay people would call fish. Okay, so Pisces are more or less fish. Now, one sort of thing that pops up on these popular science articles, if you look through them, is that when you move to a cladistic taxonomic system, Pisces kind of disappears. And the reason why is because taxa on a cladistic system are delineated by common ancestry. And the smallest clade that contains all fish also contains all tetrapods, right? And that means that it's also going to contain humans. So the smallest clade that contains fish also contains humans. So what, if you look at these pop science articles, sometimes they'll say, it turns out humans are fish. Or other articles might say, it turns out there are no fish. And it's not actually clear what the right response to this is, right? The successor concept doesn't nicely line up with fish at all. Now, the overall problem here is that cladistic taxonomic categories don't map to their predecessors in a super neat way, or at least some of them don't, right? Now, can we say that the functions of the original concept Pisces are preserved in the successor? Well, maybe. I mean, is there a successor to Pisces? Is the human slash fish slash all tetrapods category the successor to Pisces? It's not entirely clear to me. And I think this sort of case is going to end up problematic, even if you are willing to recognize something like multiple functions or multiple topics. It's not clear to me that any clade shares any topic with Pisces, for instance. Okay. I don't have a full positive account for you, partially because I'm running out of time and partially because I just don't have one. But I'm going to suggest kind of an approach that I think might work out if it were detailed. And the basic of that approach is moving away from looking at a single concept and looking for features of a single pre-engineering concept that have to be preserved in the successors to make the engineering proposal permissible. Right? Oops. Here we go. Okay. I think instead what's more promising is to look for the sort of continuity that we need to preserve inquiry, for instance, to find that kind of continuity at a higher level, right? At the level of a set of concepts or of a classificatory practice as a whole, right? So if you think about the sort of move to clades in biology, my immediate sort of reaction to the fish case is to say that Pisces doesn't have a successor in the cladistic system. It doesn't at all. But that the conceptual change involved in moving taxonomic systems was permissible because the functions served by the taxonomy as a whole are preserved and maybe better served in the successor system, right? So we don't worry too much about whether the functions of Pisces have been preserved. We worry about whether the functions of the taxonomy have been preserved in the successor system. So here's a sort of a preliminary idea, right? So maybe what it is for a revision or a replacement to be permissible is for certain important features, maybe functions, maybe something else, but for certain important features of the entire pre-engineering classificatory system to be preserved somewhere in the post-engineering classificatory system. If you go that route, then you don't necessarily need to figure out which elements of the successor set serve as a successor to any particular element of the initial set, right? We don't need to worry about what the successor to Pisces is or the successor to any particular A. Identity relations among these concepts don't matter. Similarity relations among these concepts don't matter. What matters is the continuity in the entire system or set. Now, one thing about that type of approach is it makes it a little funny to ask whether or not a conceptual engineering proposal has changed the subject, right? Unless you think that we can sort of talk about the subject of an entire set of concepts and whether that entire set has the same subject as the entire successor set. But depending upon how broad these sets are, and I'm willing to say that they could be as broad as our entire conceptual repertoire as a whole, this sort of worry about the subject and changing the subject, I think it goes a little bit off track when you move to this sort of approach that I'm suggesting. Okay, so here's, I think this is the last slide. So rather than ask whether or not the subject has been changed, what I think we should focus on are the reasons why subject change was supposed to be a problem in the first place. And I mentioned these at the very start of the talk, and there were two of them. The first was the worry that inquiry will be disrupted. There will be disruption of inquiry. And the second was the worry that problem solving, philosophical, scientific, whatever, will be trivialized because you can sort of stipulate your way around it. And I think we can sort of ask about those problems directly without worrying about changes of subject, right? So did the move from Linnaean taxonomy to cladistic taxonomy disrupt the continuity of inquiry? No, I think it improved our inquiries, right? Did it trivialize problem solving? No, I don't think it did, not at all, right? So the problems that motivate Strawson's worry here, I think, aren't there for this sort of move. Even though, I mean, we sort of changed the subject away from fish because it turns out there aren't any, or that, you know, I'm a fish. So that's what I'll close on this suggestion that there is a worry behind Strawson's problem, but I don't think the right way to approach that worry is by worrying about change of subject or preserving subject or identity of subject or identity of even something like topic or the same concept or any of those notions. I think we can address these problems more directly. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Thanks, I'll stop.